Okay, so with that, I'm just gonna start tonight. So today we're going to be going over social perceptions and behavior. We're gonna go over stereotypes and a few more terms related to that. And I'm Jenelle, I'm one of the MCAT tutors here at Socratic Med. And this is just a reminder for anyone who doesn't know already. So all of these videos will be uploaded to YouTube after they are complete. And so this is just a consent audio or video recording release. And if this would be the time to change your name to your initials or change your profile pictures for anything that you might not be, or change your information to anything that you would be more comfortable with if it was released on YouTube. Okay, and just a reminder about the course. So we're in a 15-week MCAT course right now, and this started on June 17th. We have lectures from Thursday through Saturday at 8:30 p.m. EST, and then one office hour session at the same time on Sundays. And here we have our GroupMe, which is where any updates or changes about the course can be found. It's also a great way to contact all the MCAT tutors and other students that are going through this process like you. And we also have our YouTube channel here where all of the full lectures will be posted right after the live lectures are done. And so just want to double check if everyone could, mute. So our learning objectives today are to review mainly concepts and terms associated first with the self, then with perception, and then also, didn't realize that was, and then review additional concepts and terms associated with social behavior with other types of groups, and also review factors that influence behavior and those that maintain social inequality. And then also, finally, we're gonna kind of wrap it up by reviewing forms of health and healthcare disparity. So the first part that I wanted to talk about is the self, because I feel like these terms are the basis of understanding the next sections that we're gonna go into. And so starting off with self-perception, I think the important term here is self-concept, or how someone perceives and evaluates themselves. And it's made up of both the existential self, which is the sense of being separate and distinct from others, and awareness, which is the self that is constant or consistent throughout life. And on top of this, there is also a categorical self, which is when you become aware that even though every person is distinct, there's also the fact that we exist in the world with others, and we're still, working together. Carl Rogers specifically believed that self-concept had 3 different components, which were self-image, how we view ourselves, self-esteem or self-worth, which is how much value we place on ourselves, and the ideal self, which is what we wish or aspire to be. And theories associated with the self include the social identity theory, which is a person's sense of who they are based on their group membership. And this is made up of both the personal identity, which are things unique to each person, like, for example, personality traits, and social identity, which are the groups that one belongs to in a community. And then now we're going to go into self-esteem. And so, as I mentioned earlier, a little bit about self-esteem and self-worth. So what self-esteem is defined as is the respect and regard one has for oneself. And then self-worth is considered a deep knowing that one is of value, lovable, necessary of this life, and also of incomprehensible worth. And finally, here, self-efficacy is a belief in one's abilities to succeed in a situation. These main terms, I would say, or actually in general for the psych-soc section on MCAT, I would say it's pretty important to know what all the terms definitions are. I think that can really help you narrow down the answer choices for when you're looking through passages and questions, because really I feel like the terms, the answer choices that they give usually have very different meanings, and so from there you can figure it out. So it's important like to know and understand all of these. So between self-efficacy, there is strong self-efficacy, which is considered when someone is able to recover quickly from their setbacks, and really, I guess, an acronym that helps to remember all of these different aspects of having strong self-efficacy is the acronym RISE, which R is for recover, so fast recovery. I is for interest, you have that strong, deep interest. S is for a strong sense of commitment to, the tasks that you're and goals that you have. And then E for enjoying challenging tasks that would help you, continue to grow and learn more. On the flip side of that is weak self-efficacy, which is when individuals focus on personal failures or negative outcomes. They avoid challenging tasks and often quickly lose confidence in their personal abilities, and which leads them to feel like they lack the ability to handle these difficult situations. And the acronym for weak self-efficacy is FALL. So kind of similar as before. F is for the failures, A is for avoiding challenging tasks, L is for losing confidence, and L is lacking ability to take on complex tasks. So there are also different ways that can strengthen self-efficacy, and one of these is the mastery of experience. So, mastering a certain skill will make you feel that you are able to perform this certain task and keep, recovering and growing and learning. Also, social modeling, which is when you're like seeing people similar to yourself complete the same task, it causes you to also strengthen your self-efficacy because you can see that someone else is doing it, so it is possible. And also social persuasion, when someone says something positive to you, helps you overcome self-doubt. So in that sense, it helps you, continue the task and increase self-efficacy. And then psychological responses and learning how to minimize stress and all of these, other factors that help you increase your belief in yourself also improves self-efficacy. The other aspect that affects, how you feel about yourself also tends to be the locus of control, which is the extent to which people perceive they have control over events in their lives. So it's broken up into internal locus of control, which is when people believe that they can influence events or outcomes in their life, which actually tends to allow them to believe like more into themselves. And then external locus of control is when they attribute events to environmental events or outside causes that is not really due to their own actions. And next, so we were just talking about like how self-perception kind of develops. And so now we're going to go a little more into socialization, which is the process by which people learn the attitudes, behaviors, and values expected by their culture or community through through observations and interactions. So by the socialization, it usually causes people to have different ways of perceiving themselves. And so one of these terms that is worth it to know is the looking glass self, which is a person's sense of self in terms of self-image and self-concept that usually develops from, interacting with others, and also how you perceive other people's opinions of you to be. And this concept was developed by Charles Cooley. So, usually he believed that how other people perceive you to be, so like how do I appear to others, what do others think of me, all these kind of questions cause people to kind of modify their behaviors to to match often these other people's opinions. And then the halo effect is the tendency for people to have inherently good or bad natures rather than looking at individual characteristics from a first impression. So when someone has a good first impression, usually it causes people to think of them having this halo effect and kind of letting all their following actions from that first impression all kind of tend to be on a positive light. And then another aspect of how people view the world is and perceive it is by the just world hypothesis, which is the belief that noble actions perform. So when noble actions are performed or good deeds, it usually is rewarded to that individual. And then on the flip side, if there are any bad deeds that someone is doing, then they would be punished. And so they believe that there should be this predictable result associated with their actions. However, in the world, there are things that don't quite follow those rules. So what individuals do because of this is a mixture of rational techniques, in which they accept reality as one option. They also tend to prevent or correct injustices by, forming charities or signing petitions in order to change the legal system. And then the other side of that would be irrational techniques, which is when people just deny the situation or refuse to accept it. And then they also try reinterpreting the events or change it. And the cause, and also just change interpretation of how that outcome is. So I have a question right here, and I'm going to start the poll right now. It goes over some of the main, I feel like, terms that they like to test on. But I'm going to give you guys 2 minutes to work on it. And yeah. If anyone has any questions up to this part, also feel free to put it in the chat or unmute. Okay, I'm gonna give you guys about 20 more seconds if you guys want to get your answers in. You can, all these answers are anonymous, so you can choose whatever you wish, because we'll definitely go over it if there is any confusion. Okay, so I'm gonna end it. So right now I see that we have everyone choosing choice C. Let me just Sure. Everyone choosing choice C. So great job. The answer is choice C. So just to quickly go over it, because I think everyone got it. The question says a student did bad on a test and attributed the outcome to not studying and knows that she can succeed in the next exam by studying harder. Which two terms best explains how she perceives her outcomes and herself? So we know that the answer is C, internal locus of control first, because she knew that the bad result on her exam was because of herself not studying. So she attributes that to her own actions. And then self-efficacy is because she knows that she can succeed in the next exam by studying harder. And as we kind of reviewed, studying self-efficacy is related to an individual's ability that they perceive they can succeed in an activity or their goal. So great job. Any questions about this? Okay, then I'm going to go into the next part of our session, which is perception, but kind of like on a larger scale instead of just how it affects one individual and their self. So perception is the way sensory information is organized, interpreted, and also consciously experienced. And so one of these is the attribution theory, which is very associated with perception. It's how we explain behaviors of others and events around us. And so this is broken up into internal and external side. So internal is with a dispositional attribution, which is when they believe that the behavior of others is due to an individual's personality. And then the external or situational attribution is when they believe that someone's behavior is due to perhaps the external event environment that they're put into. And it is quite common that most or a lot of people have the fundamental attribution error, which is what some theorists believe in the past, which is when a person puts more weight on internal causes rather than external causes when trying to explain another person's behavior. On the other hand, though, when we consider our own behaviors, we are more likely to blame them on our environmental factors and kind of view ourselves as victims of the circumstance instead of blaming it on our internal factors. So Kelly's covariation model goes over different factors that might help influence this weight of whether it is an internal attribution or an external attribution. And so she uses consistency for time, distinctiveness of the situation, and consensus, like the amount of people influencing this weight. So right, so when consistency is high, it tends to be an attribution to internal factors. And when I say consistency, it's like in an example where you have a friend who constantly has this same behavior of maybe being late, right? We know then, or because of this consistency, it's kind of just attributed that that individual, that friend's personality is just being a latecomer to a lot of the events and not quite planning for time. So then this is something that tends to attribute to their personality. But then on the other hand, for distinctiveness, this is when, let's say that you have another friend that is always nice and has the same personality, but when they're put into a different situation, maybe there's a big party or something's happening, and then they start to kind of have a different behavior of maybe they start getting angry or something like that, then you would kind of attribute that to perhaps them being in the party, which you would then attribute as an external factor. And then consensus of people is when multiple people are doing that same behavior or that same outcome. So you could say a student that's late for school and, you know, a bunch of other of your classmates are also late at the same time. And it could be due to like a late bus or something like that. And so we know then that's an attribution to the external factors or that late bus or traffic on the highway. But also, this is just a side note that the fundamental attribution error tends to occur more in individualistic cultures, which is like Western to Europe or America, who place an emphasis on individual achievement compared to collectivist cultures, which are Eastern or Africa or Asia, where they believe that success is attributed to external factors and that their failure is attributed to internal factors. So it's kind of like an opposite of their views in these aspects. And then there is also the theory of the dramaturgical approach, which uses the metaphor of a theater to understand social interactions. So people are assumed to act in accordance with the expectations that they have an audience watching them, right? So Irving Goffman in 1940, he was the one that studied the nature of people's interactions and noticed that people planned the way they act, and also that people wanted to control how they're seen by others and they tended to act differently alone than in public. So they kind of put on a persona in front of the audience or the rest of the people that they meet with. And so that is, in a sense, the front stage when people are in a social setting and acting for an audience by putting up a front or doing a different kind of representation of themselves. On the other hand, there's the backstage. So, at the back of a theater when people are getting ready and everything, but it's associated with the private area of our lives. So when the act is over and you can be yourself, so this is like your true self. And it also happens to be a training period. So time to get ready for impression management, which is the next term, which is our attempt to control how others see us on the front stage to be seen in a positive way. And also just wanted to mention that for impression management and with the term of front stage, people are allowed to have different front stages. So like, even if you're thinking as a student, right? You're a student on one hand, but you could be involved in other activities like you could be like a captain of a sports team. And so you would kind of act a little different there than, let's say, if you're trying to impress your teacher to get get a recommendation from him for your for any kind of like internship or a job that you're applying to, so that they could help you with that. But just that we have different front stages that sometimes people have to act differently for. And, for these front stages, we are the ones that are trying to control how others see us and prepare for those kind of instances. And also, going on from kind of how we view others or want to present ourselves in front of others, there is the term of bias, which is the tendency to think in certain ways. And so cognitive biases often cause deviations from a standard of rationality or just, good judgment of how we view others. And so the actor observer bias is kind of similar to the fundamental attribution theory, which is when we are victims of external factors, but behavior of others is attributed to their internal factors. So yeah, that's that. And then the self-serving bias is, if we succeed, it's due to our internal or personal qualities, but if we fail, it is likely due to things outside of our control. And this occurs more in individualistic cultures because of the belief that success is because of that individual personal quality, and also is a focus for increasing that self-esteem belief. And then optimism bias is the belief that bad things happen to others, but not to us. And primacy bias is when the first impression is more important than later data. It's because first impressions are long, strong, and easily built upon. And so they're very like, that first impression really matters for most. And then there's also on top of that recency bias, which is when people place a lot of emphasis on your recent actions or recent performances more than the ones before then. So that's usually once you've gotten to know the person and interacted with them more. Okay, so now we're going to go into stereotypes, which is cognition. It's an aspect of cognition. So stereotyping is attributing a certain thought or cognition to and overgeneralizing a group of individuals. So an example of a stereotype is that people who wear glasses are smarter. That, you know, it's just a stereotype, and there are different ones throughout. Ones that I guess different people know about. And they can involve, you know, race, gender, culture, religion, even sometimes shoe size. So it's sometimes a little bit random. But the disadvantage of stereotyping is that it tends to be commonly inaccurate. But the advantage on how we view it is that it allows us to rapidly assess large amounts of social data so that you can kind of quickly narrow down certain ideas in the top-down processing or bottom-up processing that we kind of, you know, analyze situations. And stereotype threat is the fear that one will be evaluated based on a negative stereotype, which happens to be self-fulfilling most of the times when people who have this negative stereotype are told about it. So here, a negative stereotype surrounding a task can actually, you know, cause a decrease in the performance of an individual performing that task and end up leading to a negative consequence or tending that those individuals will fulfill that negative stereotype. And then there's also self-fulfilling prophecy, which is when stereotypes can lead to behaviors that affirm the original stereotypes. And then we're going to go into a little bit of prejudice, which is the assumption or an opinion about someone simply based on that person's membership to a particular group, which is also commonly associated with race, ethnicity, social class, status, power, and prestige. Something also worth it to note about status is that there are different types. So there's the ascribed status, which is the status given at birth. So, you know, if you were born a prince or in the caste system, you are kind of born at a certain level, certain status. So that would be associated with that. And achieved status is a status that you earn for yourself through the hard work that you put into it. So, you know, in different countries, you are able to do that and kind of change your status based on how much effort you put in. And then there's also master status, which is the status or trait that you believe has more importance than the other statuses that you may have. So that one defining master status. And prejudice is often due to the fear of frustration. And so this leads up to that next term, which is scapegoats, a group of people towards whom the aggression is directed. So an example of scapegoats were Jews during World War II. And, you know, they're often seen at times of economic hardship. There's also the idea of the frustration aggression hypothesis, which is a little bit more emotionally based. And when someone's frustrated, it tends to turn into aggressive impulses. But the hypothesis is that when you bottle all of this up, like they transfer the aggression somewhere else and often towards acting out to minorities because their original ideas of what they would do are not socially appropriate. And then there's also a hypothesis of relative deprivation, which is the upsurge in prejudice or discrimination when people are deprived of something they feel entitled to. So, this frustration and deprivation leads to kind of more prejudice or discrimination towards others. And so we're going to go into another question. And I see that there's some questions in the chat. So I'm going to relaunch the poll, give you guys 2 minutes to answer it. And then let me see. So could you give an example of active observer bias, please? Oh, and David here says, an example is if you do poorly on a test, you blame on not sleeping well, but if someone else does bad, then it's because they're dumb. And you associate your own actions to external causes while blame others because of internal causes. So exactly like, what David was mentioning. So an example, like another example, if I wanted to give one was, so let's take an example with the late friend again. So, or actually just like a late classmate that you see come into class, you kind of believe that, oh, this classmate is just lazy. That's his personality. That's why he came into class late. And you kind of blame it on or attribute it to like the internal factor or the person's personality, as opposed to you kind of, if you were late to class, right, you wouldn't quite think that it was because of your laziness, but you would say that it's because, maybe your bus was late and that's what caused you to be late, instead of saying that you yourself is lazy, because you kind of you would know yourself better. And so that's that certain bias that you kind of attribute all those problems to. Okay, great. So that. If anyone has any more questions, feel free to mention them in the chat or anything like that. Definitely for all the questions, I would say I will address them once we get to these like mini stopping points where we have like a polling question. And David is also going to be active on the chat to help answer any questions that arise during those time periods. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll now. Here we have 50% saying choice B and 50% saying choice C. Okay, so this answer choice is choice C, the answer, sorry. So the question says, Joe sees the new student in his class come late. He believes that this is unacceptable and believes that the new student is irresponsible and lazy. Which concept best explains Joe's perception of the new student? So I guess that my example kind of related to this, but so the answer is C, the fundamental attribution error, because as I kind of mentioned before, the fundamental attribution error has a similarity with the actor observer bias that was mentioned in that question, where the fundamental attribution error focuses more on people believing that other people's actions are due to their personality or their internal attribution more than external causes. But I would say like the actor observer bias goes a step further by saying that individuals themselves attribute most of their like bad behavior due to external factors. So because Joe is seeing that this new student is late in his class, he believes that it's because of his personality, as we can see in this question, that the student is just irresponsible and lazy, but it is possible, you know, that the student could have came late because of other external factors, which he doesn't quite think about when he's automatically like thinking about this person's lateness. On the other hand, for stereotype threat, it's more so about if they have a negative stereotype associated with a certain like group, and if someone was to mention to someone of that group this particular stereotype, so let's say it could be something like, you know, like women run, or just maybe like a women would perform a little more poorly on a certain test that they're giving just because of, you know, other factors, and then the test proctor was to say that to one of the women taking the test, and then that would impact them to most likely do badly on that test because they were told that extra information, rather than if they were just to have taken the test blindly, that most likely would not have happened. So that's kind of what stereotype threat is, where you have this negative stereotype associated with someone, and then they're also being told that before they perform the action, which eventually usually causes like a negative consequence that kind of fulfills that stereotype that others have. And then front stage is associated with, you know, how people present themselves in front of the audience or the outside world. And then primacy threat is not quite exactly a term. The other one was actually primacy bias. So just a thing to know there. Does anyone else have any questions about this question? If not, then we can go to the next one. Great. So now we're going to go into social behavior with other groups. And so this is kind of with, sorry. What is primacy bias? So I haven't gotten into that yet. So primacy bias is associated with like someone's first impression has bigger weight of how other people kind of view that other individual. It tends to be just because first impressions are strong, long lasting, and they are often easily built upon. So that first impression is very important as opposed to other data. Okay, great. So now we're going to go into social behavior with other groups. So yes, ethnocentrism and cultural relativism. So this is associated with, you know, different ethnic groups or cultural groups. And so you'll see here, so ethnocentric means like judging someone else's culture from the position of your own culture. And in ethnocentrism, you kind of believe that your culture is superior to other cultures, which can lead to cultural bias and prejudice of how you view other cultures and yourselves. And then on the other hand, there's a view of cultural relativism, which is the practice of assessing a culture by its own standards, and so that you are understanding that other cultures are a little bit different than yourselves. So you're trying to judge and understand that culture from their perspective instead of, you know, your perspective as what ethnocentrism would be more like. And then xenocentrism is when you're judging another culture as superior to your own culture. Cultural imperialism is the deliberate imposition of your own cultural values onto another culture. And then, so I kind of also then went into groups, because within each of these cultural groups, there is a sense of understanding what a primary group is, which is the closest members of the group to you personally, and then secondary groups, which are formal, impersonal, and temporary business-like relationships that you kind of just make in order to fulfill a goal of the group, probably, like especially in a business-like setting. And then there's also an in-group, which is the group that we're connected with, and people tend to have more favoritism for that in-group. And, you know, within these in-groups, they kind of share certain connections, have similar ideas, and so that's what allows them to attribute themselves as being a certain group. Versus out-group, which is the group that you're not associated with and don't feel connected to, and so that's the kind of group that you're looking out at. So like with ethnocentrism, your culture would be that in group, and then you're viewing that other culture as that out group. Okay, and then so last week we mentioned a little bit, so this is a little bit going on with like in group and out group, but also building on what we learned about last week with immigrants and how their process or their ability to assimilate into society is a little bit different. And that's how come it kind of separates them from like others in the population. And so assimilation is the process by which a minority integrates socially, culturally, and or politically into a larger dominant culture and society. So some of the different factors at which others assess, or researchers tend to assess the ability to assimilate into other cultures, is socioeconomic status, which is, you know, educational attainment. It's a mixture that leads to educational attainment, occupation, and also their income. And this is compared to native born individuals. So if they tend to be more, you know, like the native born individuals, that would help them assimilate better. And then also spatial concentration. So increasing, because of the concentration, it allows them to increase their socioeconomic attainment, and also having a longer residence in the, for example, if we're saying assimilation to the US, then longer residence in the US and a higher generational status, which ends up leading to a decrease in the residential concentration for a particular ethnic group. And so being able to kind of be a little bit more spread out, but also having longer residence in a certain area allows them to continue reproducing in that area, and then also assimilating more to the certain culture, because, you know, their children grew up in that particular area. And then language attainment, which is so this is associated with the 3-generation model of language assimilation. Basically that as the generations keep on going, the most recent generations would be more fluent in the language that is spoken in that area that they're living in. So if it was in the US, then the 3rd generation or the latest one would speak only English. And so the ability to speak the same language as the larger dominant culture would increase assimilation. And then also intermarriage, which is, you know, when you're marrying with other members of that dominant culture. And it tends to be that high rates of intermarriage are an indication of social integration. And then this intermarriage reduces actually the ability of families to pass on the ethnic culture that they originally had if they were, you know, an immigrant coming from another culture. And so that causes the children to become more assimilated in that larger culture, because that is what they are able to know better. And then regarding, the previous slides where we were talking about just assimilation and also looking at different cultures, there are the ideas of first stigma, which is extreme disapproval of a person based on some behavior or quality of that person. And so it's usually you'll see a culture or a subculture, it tends to stigmatize a person based on overt physical deformations. So that's like a physical disability or other kinds of personal traits that deviate from the norm, which an example would be drug addiction, or also from the norms of their particular group. And so an example is being a loose woman in traditional Latino subculture, which these are all different examples of stigma within a culture. And eventually social stigma can potentially develop into self-stigma, and viewing yourself in the same way that society views you. And just a note is that the actions of stigma can be done by yourself, by your family, society, and media, and all these different factors, or individuals that are saying certain things about you, or your culture, or whatever particularly it is that the stigma is. And then we kind of segue into also gender roles, because there is stigma about, as we mentioned, kind of different cultures, but there are also stigmas about different genders and or like roles of different genders. And so gender roles are a set of societal norms dictating what types of behaviors are generally considered acceptable, appropriate, or desirable for a person based on their actual or perceived sex. So this tends to be supported through media, school, cultural teachings, and more. Actually, like it's just kind of taught through all of these methods, in addition to sometimes being supported by them. And so, some common ideas of gender roles is that women are assigned to take care of the family and stay at home, should be more feminine, emotional, soft, and submissive. While men, on the other hand, are, have been kind of seen as those that go to work or war. They should be masculine, aggressive, tough, and dominant in their gender role. But on the other hand, there's also different concepts related to roles and the different roles an individual may have. So one is role strain. So this is tensions within a status, and an individual is having a tough time carrying out all the obligations of that status. So we could give an example of like a mom who just, has a lot of stuff to juggle with while taking care of her child and going to work and taking care of the household. So there are times when sometimes there is a lot of strain on that activity, and that would be that role strain. But remember, for role strain, it's within one status. It's not like different types. But then here on the other hand, with role conflict, this is conflict or tension between two or more different statuses. So like an individual having different roles. So if we gave the example of the mom with, taking care of her children, taking care of the household, that's all within like that mom kind of role. But then if we also think of her as like the leader of her company, then that's kind of like an additional status role that we're thinking of here. And just the tasks for both of these activities conflict or have a lot of tension between for that individual's, for that example of that woman's time. It would probably be really hard to juggle all of these different things, and so that would be role conflict, where it's between those two or more different statuses. And then there's also the term of role exit, which is when an individual stops engaging in a previous role at all and kind of lets that go and establishes a new identity. And so they just kind of dismiss their previous role. And so now we're at another question. And I will also give you guys 2 minutes. If anyone has any questions, feel free to mention them now. Put them in chat. Anything you can unmute as well. It's whatever works best for you. Oh, okay. I see a question here. So what were your favorite resources to study PSYCH-SOC? Any specific Anki decks or documents? So I would definitely recommend, if you guys have ever browsed the MCAT Reddit, there is a Kaplan. So sorry, it's like a Khan Academy actually. It's either a 300 page or a 100 page because it's the 300 page doc that I like personally, but there's also a 100-page shortened version that others created. So on MCAT Reddit, if you were to just search like PSYCH-SOC, I believe just PSYCH-SOC Khan Academy PDF, I think you would be able to really quickly find it because they have a lot of posts that link it out to that Dropbox link. And then from there, you would be able to see like the different ones that they offer. And so I really liked personally, I like the 300 page. Some people like the 100 page because it's shorter and kind of more succinct, but I kind of liked going a little bit more in depth in that. In particular for Anki decks, I kind of just made my own based on what I was learning from that doc. So I wouldn't be able to speak that much on that side. However, I know that also on MCAT Reddit, they have a bunch of like Anki decks that they recommend as a community themselves. So potentially that's like something that you might want to check out. Also, definitely David can chime in on this in the chat if he wants to talk about like the resources that he also likes using. So yeah, I definitely recommend 300-page doc if possible. So, okay, I'm gonna end the poll here. So here we have everyone saying choice D, which is great, you guys, because the answer is choice D. So I'm going to quickly go over this. Jane and her friends are discussing the culture of their new friend, James. Jane suggests that his culture is different and it would help to understand his culture to make better judgments about similarities and differences between the friend group's culture. What view is Jane taking? And because she is noticing that his culture is different and she wants to understand his culture better through, making an effort to understand it, that's why it's cultural relativism. As you remember, from the terms before when we were going over it, like ethnocentrism is when you're kind of viewing your culture as superior to others. Xenocentrism, you believe others are superior to yours, and cultural imperialism when you're putting your ideas onto the others. So that's why the answer is B. And so now we're going to go into a continuation from what we were learning with behavior and social inequality. So just like a quick recap, if we show that continuation from first having this prejudice, first having like cognition or how you think of other people and perception, and then having a prejudice, so you have this emotional aspect, and now we're kind of into the behavior aspect, which is now behavior and social inequality. And so the behavior aspect is discrimination, which is the differential treatment and harmful actions against minorities or by sex, race, age, religion, etc., all these different aspects. And discrimination can not only happen individually, which is an individual acting to discriminate others, but also institutionally, which is when organizations, so governments, banks, others, discriminate others by rules that are set in place for these different organizations. So an example would have been like Brown versus Board of Education, where there was the segregation rules in schools at that time. There's also unintentional discrimination, which is how policies can discriminate unintentionally. They may not know it initially, but that's just how sometimes some policies are. And there's also side effect discrimination, which is how one institution in all these different fields can influence another field negatively because they're all somehow interrelated. So with like, we could do like politics and law and kind of going over, how certain laws are associated with factors that politicians may say. And so, there could be something associated with that. And then there's also past and present discrimination, which is how things done in the past have consequences for people also in the present. So an example was even after the Brown versus Board of Education had been, overturned so that schools were able to allow all races to go to to each of these schools. It's still because of that past discrimination that was kind of instilled in that institution. Even after they were allowed, it tended to be that integrated students didn't feel quite welcome in those new schools because of how long it's been that they weren't allowed in the school. And then also now we kind of go into social inequality, which are the resources, which is the idea that resources in a society are unevenly distributed. So these are just some like statistics, which in the US, the top 20% of the socioeconomic status have 72% of the wealth of the country, and the bottom 20% only control 3%. And this is just also a thing that you guys should know for that section is as you go up the social ladder, it tends to be that you have better access to education, healthcare, and housing. So all of these good things associated with a higher socioeconomic status. And then also globally, there is global, inequality as well, where an example, some statistics, life expectancy in Congo is 51 versus France or Japan, which is 84. This may have changed over some time, but this was like one in the past. And then also, there are differences in clean water, mortality rate, et cetera, between all these different countries. So then we also have groups of populations that tend to be disproportionately affected and so here we have ethnic racial minorities and those in poverty tend to have lower incomes, lower education, and reduced access to healthcare. And so, we see this inequality between different groups here. And just also some terms to know. So there is absolute poverty, which is the absolute level at which you go below. And if you go below that level, survival of an individual is threatened. So that severe of poverty versus relative poverty, which is more just a low income in one society that excludes them from maybe some of the benefits of society, but it's not threatening their survival in particular. And then also, with other groups that are disproportionately affected and having this inequality is an example with females that experience differences in the gender pay gap, and also the glass ceiling effect, which is, when they're not quite able to rise up in their positions and hold leadership, like large leadership positions in businesses, because there is this kind of barrier for women. And kind of ways to help that society has kind of come up with so far has been government schemes, so like food stamps and other resources to help these individuals that are disproportionately affected. Also trying to improve their access to education and healthcare, and also figuring out social interventions that would allow them to integrate better in society, yes. So then I also wanted to kind of go over methods that kind of sustain or maintain the social inequality, which could be from underlying factors and other terms as well. So social reproduction is the perpetuation of inequality through social institutions, such as through like education or economy across different generations, and just causing this to continue. And so some ways that this is kind of continued could be through like social capital. So social networks tends to be that higher those with higher socioeconomic statuses tend to have like wider, better social networks compared to maybe ones that don't have or are in that poverty area. And then also there's cultural capital that people can differ in, which is the understanding of other cultures, because understanding other cultures tends to also help them get a leg up in terms of like networking and understanding other individuals, connecting with them. It might help them in terms of like business opportunities or, working with other companies. And then there's also social stratification, which is the society's categorization of people in socioeconomic strata, which I guess, well, not I guess, but when you're in that lower strata, it's a lot harder to get out and move up in terms of that strata to a higher area, in which like because you're at that higher level already, you have all those resources to kind of sustain your position in society. And then speaking of moving from one strata to another, that is the term social mobility, which is the movement of individuals, social groups, or categories of people between layers or strata in the system. And this is like the opposition of social reproduction, when you're able to move up in your stratification system. And there is also a difference in like vertical social mobility. So that would be like moving up into like those more wealthier levels versus like horizontal mobility, which is you may be moving to like a different occupation level, but it would be still within that same kind of strata. Yes. And then social exclusion, so is another method that maintains social inequality because it causes people to be kind of dragged into the periphery of society, and then it doesn't give them as much access to resources or opportunities that would help them get out of certain situations like that. And could be because of poverty, ill health, discrimination, segregation. These are all factors that cause different people to be excluded from society. And then there's also the aspect of environmental justice that maintains social inequality, which is the fair distribution of the environmental benefits and burdens within society across all groups. So like with areas with high poverty and lots of racial minorities, many of them have few environmental benefits, as in like green spaces, parks, and recreations to help with, like one aspect could be health, getting the opportunity to walk around and exercise and maintain your health. These areas with high poverty instead have large environmental burden with a lot of waste and pollution, which ends up making their health not as great because of the factors that they're experiencing in their community, as opposed to wealthier groups that probably have all these environmental benefits. So, yeah. And then I wanted to end with health and healthcare disparities. So like I was just mentioning with, all these different factors that can maintain social inequality, and how these can affect health. So with a term social epidemiology, which looks at health disparities through social indicators like race, gender, and income distribution, and also how social factors affect a person's health. So this focuses on the contribution of social and cultural factors to disease patterns in populations, which are the social, also known as the social determinants of a disease. So as time has been going on, because of how people may be grouped in different categories, researchers have been finding that there are a lot of social factors that influence how their health outcomes are. And so social epidemiology is within epidemiology, like the larger branch, which is just, it deals with incidence, distribution, and possible control of diseases and other factors relating to health. And it has a significant overlap with the sociological perspective on health and disease. And so that's also with looking at how social factors influence, health and disease. And I mentioned healthcare disparities, so I'm just gonna make sure there is health disparity, which is the difference in health outcome that is closely related to social and economic factors, not by biological factors, which tend to be due to, as I kind of mentioned earlier, with poor environmental conditions, but on top of that, poor economic conditions, versus healthcare disparities, which is the differences in access to or the availability of medical facilities and services and variation in rates of disease occurrence and disabilities in different groups. So we have that slight difference between health disparity and healthcare disparities. And so these are just some points to know about healthcare disparities that has kind of been assumed on the MCAT that students would know. So one is that the quality of healthcare improves as you go up the social pyramid. And then also it tends to be that Hispanics and African Americans have higher morbidity and mortality rates. because they have worse access to healthcare and also lower quality healthcare. And then also that men typically use fewer preventative services like vaccines or checkups, and so they don't go to the doctor as much as maybe women because they require reproductive services, and also, but at the same time, their access is reduced due to local laws, because they, I guess, they tend to, sometimes they know that, and they decide to do a law like that, which I guess that's just something to know. Also, that studies for treatments for diabetes or heart disease don't always include women. So just sometimes they don't account for every single group in, or every group in the population. And then also that the LGBT community might face discrimination, which ends up limiting their clinics that they feel comfortable seeking help with, which then leads to them not quite going to as many healthcare facilities for help if they are to become ill. So that was it for my presentation today. Thank you guys for tuning in. Remember, we have office hours every Sunday at 8:30 p.m. EST if you have any questions about this or other topics. And I'll try to get this PowerPoint and recording out to you by tonight. And if you don't find them in the next day or two, please message the group me and then I'll definitely send them to you. Okay, so